Hello, my name's Dunfield and I'm the pastor of the St. Andrews Baptist Church here in St. Andrews. Well, we live in some difficult times, don't we? Anybody who's watched the news over the last few days must just be shaking their head. It seems that rioting, protesting, mob violence, whatever you want to call it, has really begun to set the norm for our society. And it depends on what side of the bill you are on. Some people see it as a good thing, some people see it as a bad thing. Different groups have protested over the last number of months, and one side will say how terrible it was, and then when the other side riots, the other side says how bad it is. But regardless, we have a mess on our hands. And you turn on top of that, you put COVID, and all of the problems that are working out of COVID, you begin to say that we're in a bit of a time of deep trouble in our nations. A time that people have started to reflect, sit back, and begin to look at in some depth. I grew up in what we now call the hippie generation. Grew our hair out, moved to California, north of San Francisco, my wife and I, and you lived a certain lifestyle, and it was freedom. And it was that we were searching for something that we felt in our society no longer had. The assurances that grew up in our father's generation after the war of prosperity and success and the house in the suburb and all those kind of things started to elude the next generation, my generation. And the Vietnam War was raging. There were protests in the streets. Civil rights movement had started. There was the assassination of Martin Luther King, the Kennedys. It was a time of turmoil. And young people in large numbers, including myself, turned off to that whole society and began to look in other directions. And we chose to, what people would now say, drop out. We found our joy in love, peace, all those kind of things. And we believed that a utopia would take place. We really believed that if enough of us believed and enough of us all worked together, there would be a transformation in America. Things would change. And then along came things like Kent State and Charles Manson. And suddenly the Haight-Ashbury area of San Francisco that was once the home of the flower children became a place of disaster, poverty, landlords putting the prices up through the roof. People couldn't afford to live anymore. And of course, through this came the drug culture. And with the coming of the drug culture, everything began to change. What happened during that time as it began to move towards the end of what we call that whole hippie movement into the early 70s? A lot of young people began to look in a different direction. They began to look for more spiritual aspects, things that could touch their heart in ways that their parents' generation had failed, the churches in a great degree had failed, and now their own culture had failed. And a lot of these young people found themselves beginning to turn towards spirituality. The Beatles had introduced Eastern religion. Swamis and gurus began to flood into the United States and Canada. Began to have the rise of real cults and very weird things going on as people began to search for spirituality. But a lot of young people, especially starting on the West Coast in Southern California, began what now we know as the Jesus movement, the Jesus people. And they were hippies, disenfranchised people who said, hey, drugs aren't the answer, dropping out's not the answer, just living day to day on the beach isn't the answer, because there's still an emptiness. that isn't filled. And they began to find their way into churches. Now, there weren't many churches that accepted them. The Calvary Chapels in Costa Mesa in California became really the leading church with Chuck Smith in accepting young people as they were. Didn't say when they walked through the doors that they had to change in how they looked. They were hoping these young people, under the influence of seeking Jesus as an answer, would make transformations within. It wasn't what they looked like on the outside, but Chuck Smith and these people during that whole Jesus revolution were looking for people to make transformation, and that they did. Today there are over 1,700 Calvary Chapels all over the United States. It was a movement that flourished out of that original Jesus movement. And literally hundreds of thousands, some people think 250 to 300,000 young people that were living in the hippie culture actually came to Christ during that period of time and became the backbone of much of the church throughout the rest of the 70s into the 80s, and became really transfigurative in how church is done. Music began to be accepted into church, so on and so forth. So why do I tell you that? It's because we live in another era where people are becoming delusioned. We were told certain things in our own culture of the prosperity and the success, stock market going through the roof, people would be successful, there would be jobs, plenty, all these kind of things happen. And I think COVID is just a quick reminder for most of us that everything can go topsy-turvy just overnight. Things can just change in a heartbeat. And that's what they've started to do. And we're seeing the unrest in countries like the United States begin to be an expression of the sourness that people have turned towards political parties, towards government, towards organized groups. There's a rebellion in the air. And one of the big reasons is people don't know where to turn. They've turned to all kinds of things in our own culture. Our culture, of course, was based not upon dropping out and living on the beach type of thing, but upon accumulation of toys, things, getting more and more, bigger houses. I remember a real estate agent in Massachusetts, where I used to live, saying that young people no longer want starter homes. They want the home, the big house. They want everything now. And they don't care how much it's going to cost in the future. All they want to know, can I afford it? Can I make the payments? I don't care if I make it for 8,000 years. Can I get into this? This is my dream home. I want it now. And what people are beginning to find, as things begin to shift in our value system and in our society and in our culture, that those things don't seem to bring the answers that people thought they would. And as a result of that, there's a new movement. It's taking place once again in California. If you go online and look up YouTube, look at Baptisms, Huntington Beach, California, September. Last September, a group of churches met on the beach at Huntington Beach in Southern California, near Life Station 20, which has become kind of well known now in Christian circles. And they met and they began to praise and worship God. And by that evening, over 1,000 young people had been baptized and come to Christ. There's a new movement beginning to take place. We don't hear much about it from the press or the media, but it is taking place. There is a form of revival beginning to take place in the hearts, especially of younger people. And a lot of Christians have said for a long time, oh, we've lost the young. We've lost the young people. We're never going to get them back. They're never going to come back to church. Well, that's just not true. They may not come back to church as we're doing it and how we do church, But the reality is that there is a movement of a stirring in the heart of a lot of young people to get to know God, to find some solid answers, concrete answers to who we are, what life's about, what's the point of it, what's my future hold? Is there a future? What is life like after COVID? And if churches are to prosper and be what God has called us to be, a light on a hill, then we need to get busy and interact with our culture. We need to begin to speak to it. We begin to reach out, listen to what people are saying instead of talking all the time. We've been good at that at the church. We just never stop telling people what to do, how to do it. And we very seldom have listened to anybody who has asked us questions. We as Christians, and I'm talking to everybody who's watching, who calls themselves a believer, we need to rethink about our priorities, not do away with what we believe. That is core. But we need to rethink on how we're going to reach people with questions that are quite a bit deeper than maybe even some of us have ever dealt with. And we need to be able to interrelate with people fairly, honestly, answer questions the best we can. If we can't, say we don't know. Say we're stuck. There are lots of things that I don't know the answer to when it comes to my faith. But that's exactly what I have. I have a faith. It's not a blind faith. It's a faith based upon my understanding of the Word of God and how it relates to me. And so I just encourage you, who are part of the Christian body out there, to be courageous. Don't think that everything's falling apart. Don't think, oh, the end's here and everything's going to come to an end. Instead, have courage. Begin to pray for your neighbors, your friends, your family. Hold them up before God. Interact with them in conversation. See what they're thinking, what their views are, what their fears are, how they're handling these. And then begin to give an answer for the faith that is within you, the hope that is within you. Be sincere and be courageous. Anyway, my name's Lad Dunfield, and I'm the pastor of the St. Andrews Baptist Church here in St. Andrews, New Brunswick. And any weekend you're free, just come on down. We'd love to have you visit with us. Our church service is from 10:30 to 11:30. We're the church on King Street with two steeples, a yellow and white church. Stay safe, keep courageous, and see you next week. Bye now.